All right. Hello, everybody. Um, Welcome, everybody, to today's installment of Committee for Sydney Live. We have a really interesting discussion today, looking at some of the global dimensions of COVID-19, looking at ways that different countries are approaching the same virus, and doing some thinking about how global institutions and global relationships might end up being reshaped by this. I'm Gabriel Metcalf. I am the CEO of the Committee for Sydney, and we are really pleased to have you all here with us. I want to remind you that you can click on Gallery View on Zoom if you want to see people that way, and also that you can type questions which come to me via the Zoom question app, and I will do my best to sort through those and combine them. We have a really amazing panel, so let me just give you their bios. Bill Bowtell is a public health consultant and former advisor to the Prime Minister. He has a particular interest in national and international health policy structures and reform. Bill trained as a diplomat with postings in Portugal, Papua New Guinea, and Zimbabwe. He played a very major role in the introduction of Medicare. James Crabtree is Associate Professor of Practice at the Kuan School of Public Policy in Singapore. He's a Singapore-based author and journalist. His best-selling book, The Billionaire Raj, was presented at the Committee for Sydney a year or two ago. It was a great event. Prior to being an academic, James worked for the Financial Times. Most recently was covering Indian business as Mumbai Bureau Chief between 2011 and 2016. And then finally, Professor Glenda Sluga is Professor of International History at the University of Sydney. Glenda is Professor of International History and ARC Kathleen Fitzpatrick Laureate Fellow at the University of Sydney. She has published widely on the cultural history of international relations, the history of European nationalism, sovereignty, identity, immigration, and gender history. Her most recent book is Internationalism in the Age of Nationalism. She is a past visiting fellow at a number of major institutions, including Oxford, University of Vienna, Harvard, Monash, and ANU. So with that, I want to start out with James Crabtree. James, you have been writing about the Asian technocracy. So Hong Kong, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, different to China, which it's easy for everybody to say, oh, well, that's a dictatorship, that's different. But these democracies, for whatever reason, they've been handling this better, apparently. Have they really been handling it better? If so, why? What are they doing?
Yeah, well, thanks for having us here, Gabriel. It's a great pleasure to be back with the committee, albeit virtually. I hope everyone in Sydney is doing okay. I know this is a very difficult time. So I'm sitting here in Singapore. It's pouring with rain outside, but life is going on at least half as normal. I can look out of my window and see the freeway outside of our house, which it's got half as many cars on it as it normally has. But there's still cars. The schools are still open. Restaurants are still open, and that's in part because Singapore, in common with these advanced Asian democracies, as you say, seems to have handled this crisis better than others. I think the thing about a crisis is that it's we sometimes call these stress tests. These are the moments in which we discover the truth of things underneath by putting huge strain on our institutions. And what we found is that these advanced Asian countries have handled this better than the Western liberal democracies, either the Anglo democracies in the northern or southern hemisphere or in Europe. And now, why is that? I mean, it's partly because they've had more recent experience of pandemics, or at least, if not pandemics, then infectious diseases, the SARS outbreak, the MERS outbreak, H1N1. I'm sure we'll go on to talk about this, but that means in a very practical sense that their governments have been less complacent. They have stockpiles, they have institutions, they have protocols. They sort of didn't think that this was a black swan event that wasn't going to happen. And now we realize that the odds of something like this happening were actually reasonably foreseeable. The British government official preparedness document put the likelihood of a pandemic of this sort at somewhere between 1 in 2 and 1 in 20 over the next couple of decades, which are actually reasonably manageable odds. But I think at a more profound level, it's shaken up the image that the old West have had about the superiority of our institutions. There has been this sense for a long time that our systems have tended to work better than everywhere else's, and I think that's been found wanting in a deeper sense, both in the way that they've been funded in the aftermath of the financial crisis, but also the way that they work in general, the way that they're coordinated. So I think this is a reckoning for Western countries about the sort of underlying state of our institutions. And I think it's more helpful, rather than seeing this through the lens of US, China, and have dictatorships or democracies cope better with this. The countries that have coped better are those that have efficient, well-funded states that are able to plan for the long term, that are run by experts and technocrats who are able to think through things like this. They have done better. And those that have more fractured, polarized systems that haven't funded themselves properly, particularly in areas that Bill is an expert on in public health, have done much worse.
Glenda, it's interesting thinking about the tension between nationalism and internationalism. This is a moment when the international institutions seem to be completely absent or weak, when we see countries closing borders. We also see that the role that the United States would have played with a certain part of the world of rallying countries together for coordinated action is completely missing. What does this moment tell us about the state of the international institutions and what it is and what it needs to be?
I think it tells us a lot about what's changed over the last half century and how different the early 21st century is from the 20th in many ways, because what we have is a globalized world with a deficit of really global politics and of global we have global connectivity of all sorts, but not global thinking. And a recent UN document that came out in late March, so really only about a week ago, which I was reading it, it's quite detailed about what they want and how they think, because all of the challenges we face, if we think of the pandemic inside these other, large global challenges, such as systemic capitalism, the crises in systemic capitalism, and also climate change, these are global problems. And yet, the kinds of solutions that are being kind of bandied about are increasingly national and local. Now, those things have to take place, but what's happened to the global infrastructure is quite important as well. So, I mean, the WHO has been there, but it has also been, diminished in its capacity in its authority, if you like. There was a point at which the United States absolutely rejected any interference from the WHO, any offers of assistance as well. So I think that, if we go back to James's point about this as a stress test and revealing the kind of the weakness of institutions, they're not just the state-based institutions, but actually the international institutions that had been created in the context of similar kinds of crises and global crises through the 20th century, and had functioned to kind of create certain norms around human rights, around social conditions and expectations, and really changed the landscape, the political and social landscape of the 20th century. That space was emptied out in the course of the version of globalization that we got after the 1980s. And that's, I think, what the stress tests have exposed.
Just to pursue that thread, Glenda, do you hear do you hear any serious discussion about a new architecture for international coordination around things like this? Or is it too soon to know?
There is discussion about anticipating this as a moment when, as with other moments, like in the course of the Second World War or in the course of the First World War, and the kinds of, in fact, the health crises after the First World War, the opportunity that was grabbed, if you like, in the context of those crises, and people are aware of that history and saying, right, we're in the middle of something similar. Are we going to take this opportunity? And I think the way to take it is to start having the discussions. So the UN paper that came out hasn't been discussed at all. And it feels a bit sad. They're calling for things like 10% of global GDP being put aside to deal with the global nature of these crises and building new kinds of institutions. And I think whatever happens, if having the conversation is really important, and understanding that, the polarization of the political debate between national interest and international or global isn't helpful, because there are many more alternatives and possibilities within the space connecting nation states and the rest of the world. And we know from our industries, global supply chains, but also tourism, all those industries that support healthy national economies in the Australian context, for example, they all rely on us being connected in the world and making sure that it's not just the health of our institutions and the Australian nation, but actually, or even the Victorian or the Queensland, it depends on how you break it down, but actually the health of global health institutions and people is really at stake and needs to be addressed. So it's at every level, and it's the interconnections that are really important.
Right. So even though Australia is an island and it's easier to close international borders if it wants, that would of course destroy the whole economy. Australia is incredibly globally connected.
Yeah. So, and a tourism economy and all those things. So, it's a very narrow view of, to think only about the national, or even, see these debates sometimes come down to even, suburb locations. I think that interconnectivity is really important to kind of put back on the conversation discussion agenda. I was reading, a really important piece by, the member of the opposition in the newspapers recently on making the most of this moment, and and the kind of what we call the ego health of the society of the nation. But actually, yes, that conversation in the context of a conversation about global responsibility, obligation, and belonging.
Bill, based on your experience with public health, as you look out at the UK, the US, Canada, how do you place Australia's response so far? How does it compare to what other similar countries are doing? What do you see happening?
Well, it's been no good. And the reason for that in Australia, the US and the UK has been a very pernicious intellectual virus that spread in the last 10 or 20 years, this toxic individualism, the Anglosphere concept, the hollowing out of the state. And in Australia, that took place in an accelerated way after 2013, when the Abbott government came to power. They fully subscribed to the doctrines that came out of America and were repeated in the United Kingdom. And it's no accident that those three countries all adopted pretty much the wrong strategy coming out of the United Kingdom as an intellectual construction, and that was on the so-called herd immunity principles that accepted this thing could run. And it was a great intellectual construction to cover up the hollowing out of our institutions and our ability to respond in a collective and sensible way. I was involved in the Australian response to HIV back in the early 1980s. And I can tell you then that Australia was a fully collectively organised, strong, resilient country with very well functioning institutions, and was able to prepare and to a great degree see off the arrival of HIV/AIDS in Australia. It was a collective action. It was backed by the united will of the Parliament, that is, the leaders on both sides. There was no political dissension. There was no having an ideological debate in the middle of a crisis. It was all put to one side. And we just got on with the job of working with fact and science and evidence to repel the virus. Now, Tom Friedman in the New York Times the other day made a very good point. The virus is an expression of chemistry, biology, and physics. These are ineluctable laws. They cannot be beaten. And you can only beat the laws of nature by deploying logic and the laws of science and evidence and nature against it. First, to make physical distance. That's all we've got to do, and restricting movement. And then hopefully, I hope, but I have no idea, but I hope that all the power of science and evidence can be brought, and fact can be brought to bear on creating some sort of vaccine in due course. But there is no doubt whatsoever that the three countries that were in the Old West, as you like, I don't think that construction's any helpful anymore, as James is saying. In the Old West were Australia, the United Kingdom, United States. The UK and the US are worse because they're bigger populations and were on the trade routes. But in doing it, finally it came to one big question of outlook in Australia. They looked to the Anglosphere for their inspiration, and in doing so in this country, they ignored what was completely obviously taking place in Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, where they prepared. They were forewarned and they were forearmed. I came back through Singapore in February from London, where I'd gone to escape actually the terrible calamity of the bushfires, which seems decades ago.
Remember the bushfires?
In Singapore, it was all systems go. And I arrived in Sydney, to my astonishment, thinking back to the SARS and MERS days, nothing. I mean, there are actually very few people doing anything. Baggage, customs, nobody temperature checking, nobody mobilising, and that was never fixed up. It is still at Sydney Airport, I know, of a couple of days ago, a complete mess. Well, I mean, really? That's the best we could do? We could have done it very easily 40 years ago in HIV, and basically the collapse of the Australian state in coordinating and organising something on this has just been utterly, utterly shocking.
Bill, there's been some discussion about federal structures. So Canada, US, Australia. It's very hard to, for one thing, it's hard to have a coordinated message when premiers and governors can each represent their community and have a different message. Hard to speak with one voice, and so the public, it ends up squandering public trust because the public is a little confused. It's also there's also an issue where the weakest link in a federal system, whichever state or province is doing the least good job controlling an infectious disease, it then can spread to all the other states and provinces. Do you think this is going to lead to any kind of rethinking about the way federations work?
Yes, well, federation was a quaint 19th century idea when the British Empire and it's started to put out sort of independent or quasi-independent states, and they were all compromises between capital and labour, and the distances between cities and so on in Australia was very long, and they're all settled by sea, so they created little entities. But it's an idea whose time has just come and gone. The Australian Federation has completely failed to live up to any any semblance of responsibility. Going back to the AIDS days, we created at the outset one unified national response against the federation model, And we had one source of authority and advice about the science, one source about the preventive measures that were terribly radical and bold for those days, really, about sex and drugs and so on. And the politicians just walked off the stage. But we spent enormous numbers of days and months making sure that everybody in the federal structure was agreed and supportive. Now that just at the first sign of coronavirus, despite all of their plans, despite all of the great words, it fell to pieces. And we saw in the Australian context this so-called the Ruby Princess. Now, on paper, they had organised between Border Force, Biosecurity, New South Wales Health and everybody else how to prepare for such an eventuality. At the first sign of real stress, it utterly fell to pieces. And 250 plus people were decanted off the Ruby Princess with coronavirus, and nobody will take responsibility. Nobody will sheet home the blame to where it truthfully lies. But really, at its heart, it's an indictment of how we run and organise this continent. I don't think the Federation in Australia, in any meaningful sense, and as we used to know it before, can possibly come back. It certainly has lost the faith and trust of the Australian people. And it's one thing that I personally I'll spend a lot of time thinking and advocating for it, because it cannot go on like this in Australia.
All right, let me pick up on this notion of state capacity, of, does the government have the ability to organize and mobilize and coordinate to undertake big things? James, you are living in the land with maybe the highest state capacity of any place right now, Singapore, but your previous home was at the other end of the continuum in India. So far, most of the news has been about wealthier countries, but as last week, the photographs of the millions of Indians being, I think, forced back to the countryside because they had no way to survive a lockdown where they were, I think brought home to many people that we're now going to be entering a phase of the pandemic where countries with much lower state capacity are faced with the spread of the virus. James, I'm curious what your views are on how this might play out in places like India.
Yeah, thanks for that, Gabriel. I fear not well is the short answer. It's interesting to go back to what Bill was saying. I think that if you look at the Western countries, it is true that there are certain advantages and disadvantages to particular systems of government. But if you look at Germany, for instance, Germany is the one European country that seems to be doing, one major European country which is doing reasonably well, which has a strongly federalized and decentralized system. And so you have to sort of temper this question of structure with a whole bunch of other factors. What is the state of your industrial base? How quickly are you able to turn around factories making one thing into making factories and making other things? How historically, how well funded has your health service been? How many beds do you have? All these sorts of things. Somewhere where South Korea and as well as Singapore and Taiwan has done particularly well. And so in the end, this question of state capacity in the advanced countries is complicated. The measures that the World Bank have of governments that work well have hundreds of different indicators. And so it shouldn't surprise us that there are going to be at least dozens of factors that are going to decide which countries were able to identify this and move quickly, and which were held back either by the path that they were on or the kind of leadership that they would have. But all of them are likely to respond much better than those countries that have, weakly funded, weakly coordinated governments, of which India, unfortunately, is a good example. Actually, India has moved quite quickly. It introduced the national lockdown much more speedily in the process than many of the Western countries have. But unfortunately, the measures that are possible to undertake in advanced industrial economies, where, for instance, you have some substantial portion of the population who is still able, fortunate enough to work from home, where you have, financial resources to, at least for a period of time, try and cushion the worst of the economic blow, although there's open questions as to how that is. That's not going to work in a country like India, where 50% of the population still make their living off the land. And as you say, you have large migrant populations. So I think now public health authorities are realizing, well, not realizing, they already know, the rest of us are realizing that there are going to have to be different strategies in countries that have low state capacity, where instead of learning from South Korea or Singapore or Taiwan, you're looking to West African countries and how they dealt with Ebola. What kind of measures can you introduce that balance people's need to eat and to maintain a basic level of subsistence with trying not to spread the pandemic. And so it may be that the example of somewhere like Singapore is really not much use to a country like India, that is going to have to come up with a different kind of strategy to keep the show on the road. But in the end, the picture is hard. I mean, in the end, the richer industrialized countries, no matter who they are, whether it's a country that has done badly into this like Italy or the United States, or one that's done well like Taiwan or Japan, they're all going to be able to respond to this better than poor or lower middle income countries, because they have resources and capabilities that others don't have.
Right, I have many questions coming in, which is great. So everybody feel free. I'm going to combine a couple here. A question for you, Glenda. People are very hopeful about a notion you introduced, going back to the analogy of World War II, that in response to the cataclysm, international institutions were created that did do a lot of good for a period of time. But the question is, what does it take for crisis to lead to successful response? Because of course, after World War I, Woodrow Wilson tried to get the League of Nations going, and it didn't take. And it took a second World War before it took. And of course, one could argue that the United Nations has never actually gotten the capacity that many of its proponents would have wished it could have had down through to the present day. But thinking about the crisis we're in now and speculating about the future.
I'm going to go on about history if you don't stop me, but I think one of the interesting things is that we're learning more about the history of these moments in the 20th century. So that, the League of Nations was a success in many ways as a system, and it was a product not of just Woodrow Wilson. I mean, I think we can sort of almost write him out of it, but it was actually, during the First World War, there were League of Nations associations set up from the ground up throughout England. It took hold in Australia. Universities had them. There was a Sydney-based one. There's a whole lot of new work being done, social history of these movements and how important they were. They were often linked to political figures. Political figures were involved from all parties, but they brought together experts and political figures, but often also, women's movements, all sorts of different local social movements. And the same thing happened more or less during the Second World War under the tutelage of government support in the United States, for example, for various reasons, for thinking about a post-war and new kinds of institutions. But I think the main point to make in this is that in each case, they did establish institutions that were more than just the League as an institution that stopped war or not, but actually all sorts of very practical bureaucracies and bodies that helped share data about health, also about employment, about industry, about all sorts of ways in which we know we're in a global world and we're connected. And they really were very important in encouraging debate and discussion about what kind of world. The other point I'd want to make is, and this is what that UN document from March a few weeks ago, or a week ago, makes, and that is that it's not just like a matter of these institutions, but it's a matter of really thinking creatively, because what we're faced with is very different even from the Second World War or the First World War, because of the three crises we're facing, not just the pandemic, not just the systemic crisis of capitalism, but actually climate change. And that just changes everything. And so the extent of creativity required, I don't want to undersell the international institutions, because undergirding them is an obligation to global responsibility and to some notion of shared existence in the world. But if we take climate change as a broader context for the pandemic as well, and for what kind of world we can have afterwards, what kind of capitalism, for example, we can practice or institute, continue with, then really we're faced with the challenge of creativity. In the First World War, in the Second World War, it was always thought of, the potential of imaginaries, of new kinds of ways of imagining the world and institutions. And I think that's what's at stake now, that we do actually have to think about what we have. We have to remember those international institutions and think about what they've been able to do. But we actually are in a very different position, because this is much more existential question about, our existence and our place in the world and on the planet. So even before the pandemic, these are the conversations that have been taking place. Some of them have come out of health institutions. The idea of planetary health is one that says, whatever the health challenge, it's connected to questions of social inequality, of economic opportunity, and of political stability. So we need to think holistically, and of course the environment. And the bushfires, I think, are connected for us, because they really were an opportunity, or they demanded that we think about Australia and the kind of economic policies that we have, and how we find sustainable economic policies in order to not only take responsibility for the existential crises here that climate change is provoking, but in the world. So, imagination, creativity, and the willingness to actually pursue these conversations and think about how interconnected the challenges that we face are.
Glenda, how much of that can depend on almost the coincidence of who the leaders are? I mean, thinking about the difference between Donald Trump and Angela Merkel, Ming Long asks, is the success of the response from Western democracies more dependent on leadership than state capacity?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, if you've got, if you've got people around whom, you can kind of identify these possibilities and the provocation to working through these global challenges with institutions that are already there and thinking about what else you can change. I mean, that's important, but, think about the role that individuals who aren't political leaders have played in the last few years, like Greta Thunberg and others. So yes, leaders are important and they make a difference. Donald Trump has really changed the capacity for the United States to respond, for example, to climate change, because in the middle of this pandemic, all sorts of laws are being disassembled that were contributions to trying to cut emissions within the United States. So obviously leaders make a difference, but so do social movements within liberal democracies. And I think that's where I have a problem with, I'm not, obviously if you have a centralized state and one authority and you listen to one expert and you don't, fuff around with layers of government, you might think that's better. But, we've seen how the problems that's led to in China, for example, in terms of the fact that early on, there were difficulties in managing the crises because of the fears of the, middle level political leaders and not wanting to look bad in the kind of bigger picture. And I don't, so, and now the debates are about to what extent are these moves to centralization going to actually, embed more authoritarian political states where, in fact, you might not get an individual or a government that's interested in tackling climate change, for example. So always we need to think about, I think, the capacity for liberal democracies and even federal state levels to encourage debate. And that's the question, how to have really good conversations, how to sponsor really good debate within federations, at different levels and globally about these challenges. So leaders are important, but so are the political context, the kinds of the debate that can happen, and the social movements, what happens from the grassroots up. And history has shown that is as important. And of course, it can go the other way. We're seeing in Italy already kind of rumblings of discontent and fear about, and also desperation because of the economic consequences of the lockdowns and the pandemic. And so, really, that's why the responsibility has to work both ways. And it's very easy for me to say all these things, of course, but important to remember that when it's worked in the past, it's worked because of debate, conversation, imagination, creativity, and the willingness of governments nationally to work with each other transnationally to solve these issues.
Bill, I've got several questions picking up on one diagnosis of a ultimate cause of toxic individualism. You said, do you see the current willingness of people in Western countries to accept more of a notion of the greater good, to make personal sacrifices for other people? Do you see that as something that might be socially transformative, might be something that endures beyond this moment?
Well, as far as the people were concerned, I'm sure it never went away. The organising principle of the people, as distinct from the people of the intellectual trends and so on, and the governments in Australia, UK, and US in recent years, the people understand the merits of collective action. No more. It's never changed. When we saw the response to the bushfires or community disasters or all those sorts of things in Australia at local level and to a degree at state level, more or less, people have always wanted collective action. They're happy to pay, to a degree, high taxation in return for a well-functioning and well-ordered state. But what happened in the last 6 or 7, 10 years is really a bunch of desperados captured the whole of the commanding heights of these states and started to trash it. Now, they never fixed things up after the GFC. We've been on a boom, like a drunken party. We had cheap money, zero interest rates basically, and a massive consumption boom, fueled by globalization and cheap goods and cheap travel, and everybody went everywhere and had a great time, not least of which was me, I've got to say. But that's over. It's gone into history. And what is going to come back, and Glenda makes very good points, we are, in my view, very much where we were the day after the Black Tuesday or Black Friday crash in October 29. The roaring 20s have gone. We're now faced, as we look ahead, with something that's got a lot of reminiscence and equivalence to what happened in the Great Depression. There was a collapse in international trade, a collapse in asset prices, very high levels of unemployment, and in some countries, massive state subsidy to try to get through it. But in most countries in those days, of course, they pulled out any semblance of collective action to look after those whose lives had been detonated by the economic collapse. And we all know where that ended 10 years later. So what we decide to do now collectively has got to be done democratically. I think in Australia there's been a hollowing out of democratic principles. It's been secret, all this response, it's been behind closed doors. Information changes are being engineered now in Australian economy and arrangements with no oversight or accountability by the parliament, no debate amongst the people, as if this crisis is so different from World War II or the Depression or all the things we've had to deal with in recent years, where the parliament and democracy functioned. Now, we are a long way from that today in Australia. And the sooner we get back to democratic oversight and argument and politics, I mean, there's a fatuous notion goes around that somehow you're not allowed to participate in intellectual debate, as if the people who got us here are the people who know best. Well, I, for one, don't agree. And I'm sure most of the Australian people don't agree. So we have to trust the people. We have to rebuild something better on the ruins. And we have to take, as Glenda said, I mean, the whole point of what happened after the Depression and the calamity of the war was that the Americans to their great credit, led a world that became interdependent. They created the United Nations. President Roosevelt, that was his great achievement, Eleanor Roosevelt and Churchill, and they understood that globally there needed to be far better and stronger international institutions. But the wrecking ball started to go through that from the Americans, from the Reagan administration on, and of course, one of the great guiding stars of the response of the Anglosphere people was the denigration and abuse and the lack of, and the funding cuts directed at all the agencies of the United Nations and international endeavour and collective endeavour. And we saw that, as James would know, culminated in the United Kingdom in Brexit. Well, how's that looking now in the United Kingdom? Not very good, I would have thought. So we're at an existential moment, as Glenda was saying. It can't be put off. We've come to the end of the road. We've kicked the cans down the road, and there's a whole pile of cans. Now, we have to get moving now to seize, not to seize control of things, but to bring the people along who deeply understand that all of this in the last 30 years has just been an illusion. And the last 10 years have really just a massive consumption boom that's now come to an end. And we're going to have to look very clearly at restoring production of basics and essentials, and putting aside all the frippery and all the silliness that marked what happened after the GFC until really about February 2020. They were the defining things. That's gone, finished.
Let me get a couple more questions here. James, a couple of questions about the tension between some of the values of liberal societies and the kind of surveillance and population control that seems to be helpful for fighting a pandemic. As you think about the lessons from the Asian technocracies for Western societies, how do you parse that? How do you tease apart is there a way to fight an infectious disease pandemic that does not require a ramped up state capacity for population surveillance and monitoring and movement?
I mean, I think it's a very interesting question because there's a balance here that clearly there are a whole bunch of new tools that can be helpful, but that they come with substantial risks. So in China, now you have the system in China that basically decides where you're allowed to move. It's an app you have on your phone. It was developed by one of the arms of Alibaba, and it gives you a traffic light, red, green, or yellow, depending on what the system tells you about your risk profile. And so a private company that works hand in glove with the government basically gets to decide whether you move around the country, and they share all their data with the public authorities and with the police and who knows anyone else. To be honest, at the moment, I think many people in Western countries, given the poverty of the response, are probably going to be quite supportive of measures that trade in efficiency in fighting the pandemic against sharing of personal information. The NHS in the UK yesterday or the day before, for instance, suspended some of its normal rules on the sharing of patient data in order to fight the pandemic. The question though then becomes is, if you do think that this is plausible and this has to be considered very carefully, then there is a long-term risk that things that we do now will stay around for a very long time to come. Now, sometimes that can be good, as both Glenda and Bill have said. These moments, although we face a very grim both public health crisis and then the economic aftermaths, both in the advanced countries and in the poor countries, these are moments in which people can look afresh at ideas that seem to be implausible before. What they sometimes call the Overton window, the window of what is plausible, what can be done, shifts very dramatically. And so now something like universal basic income, which was a fringe idea only 3 months ago is now a mainstream response. And there are a whole bunch of other things that the governments are going to end up doing that are quite radical. But on the other hand, it's perfectly possible, particularly in countries like China that really have very little in the way of privacy and data protection, but also in others, that you institute systems now that will stay with us for a very long time. So Britain's system of collective healthcare was really a function of the Crimean War. So the new NHS hospital they built in London, the NHS Nightingale, 20 years after the Florence Nightingale had begun to institute systems of collective healthcare, it was the influence of that that created the first set of legislation in the UK that began to take public health measures seriously, the mandating of the cleaning of sewers and that kind of thing. Similarly with payments for unemployment, which had some legacy in the Prussian wars. And so we just have to be careful with this, that it may very well be that some of these measures that are being taken, for instance, allowing apps to track where people are in order to do more efficient contact tracing, that in a crisis, as in wartime, exceptional measures are needed, but that we need to be very careful with this because things that are introduced in these moments of crisis have a habit of sticking with us. And so if we emerge from this with some long-term diminution of civil liberties, then that is not likely to be very positive.
Glenda, I'll try to get through a few of these kind of quickly. Sometimes crises lead to the actual downfall of a regime. Like World War I leads to the Habsburg Empire collapsing, or Chernobyl leads, one of the causes perhaps, to the end of the Soviet Union. Do you think any countries are gonna, what would the equivalent of that be today if a country handles things really badly?
I feel like that James might know the answer to that question better than me. But I do think, that you could ask that question another way and say not just what countries, but to go back to that other theme, but what relationship. Europe is you don't think of Europe as a country, but I think there's a lot of concern that the European Union, is actually very vulnerable at the moment to the economic and political crises that are coming out of the pandemic as a result of the pandemic. What do you do? Apart from the economic challenges and the disparity between the different states within Europe, which you could argue is a mirror for the world again, but what do you do when you've got a member state like Hungary, which has really utilized the pandemic as a moment to completely consolidate political and legal power in that state? When will it go back to some other? Even before, it was already challenging many of the prescripts of the political prescripts of the European Union. So can the European Union survive with a member state like that? And can it survive with the level of antagonism being directed towards it by populist parties within countries like Italy that are taking the moment to say, well, look, the European Union's done nothing, China's doing more for us, it's bringing in masks and ventilators, etc. So and we've seen just in the last day or so, the European Union come out and apologise via its spokeswoman, for not being a better sort of partner to Italy in the early stages of the crisis there. So I think that it's those relationships, and maybe federalism more broadly is really. I don't think in the Australian context it's an issue, but it's going to be an issue. But in those larger projects, and you could argue that into the 21st century, Europe has continued to be seen as a laboratory for more progressive political policies, whether towards climate change or, in fact, questions of social and economic inequality and human rights issues, as other countries, other conglomerations even, have gone in more nationalist, xenophobic, populist directions. And that's not an unproblematic representation, but it has had that status. So will the European Union survive? And I think that is a really important question for everyone, not just for the Europeans, because of the kind of project it represents at a moment when we're having to think about more creative, imaginative responses to the political, economic, that combination, intersection, explosion of political, economic, and social and environmental challenges that we face.
James, do you want to get in on that at all? Are there any regimes that might utterly fail in the face of this? And what happens if they do?
Yeah, I mean, I think things are bleak, but they're not quite that bleak in the Western economies. I mean, I think again you're more likely to see kind of protests or regime collapses in a sense much less well-resourced states, and I wouldn't discount that at all. I mean, I think we're in the very early stages of this in what looks like is going to be a long haul. It's going to take a number of years to develop a vaccine, and then a long economic period of disruption, potentially something that looks more like a global depression. And so there's going to be a lot of public anger and discontent at this. In the advanced economies, I mean, I think there are two real risks, one of which is an upsurge of a different kind of populism. And so Glenda mentioning Orban is a great example. I mean, if you are the kind of leader that lives in a state that has been hollowed out and you have autocratic tendencies, then now is a great moment to consolidate your power base. And there's lots of countries around the world where that is the case. I mean, again, sadly, it's tragic to say it, but the upcoming American election, I fear, is going to be a very unedifying contest, because the way that President Trump is going to fight for his survival, I fear is going to be staunchly nationalistic, potentially staunchly anti-Chinese, and were he to win, then there are many challenges facing the structures of the American Republic. As Glenda said, some of the Southern European nations as well that already have huge problems and staunch kind of populist parties. So I think there's a lot of stress there. And then internationally, geopolitically, this is going to create enormous problems. Firstly, tensions between the US and China, although they have cooled off a little bit in the last couple of days, I think are inevitably going to worsen because of this. And it will accelerate a process of division between these two powers, not least because it seems likely, although it isn't certain, that China is going to emerge out of this relatively stronger, and the United States is going to emerge out of this substantially weaker. And that is going to have a big effect on international institutions. I mean, as both Glenda and Bill had said, in the end, the international response needs to be coordinated by these larger powers. That's how these things work, unfortunately. And so if the larger powers are either preoccupied or fighting with one another, then the odds of the international institutions being able to do what needs to be done are much less. And that's even without going into the question that has sort of lain beneath some of our comments today about the economic changes in the nature of globalization, which is something that Australia at least will be thinking about a lot. As Bill said, changing the nature of who you rely on and for what, whether it's for the production of medical equipment or how many foreigners you can expect to come into your universities, or where you're sending your commodities to and in what volume. I mean, all of these things are now going to be looked at much more seriously than they have been over the last couple of decades.
Can I just add to that about geopolitically? I would have thought, looking around the world, the situation in Latin and South America, they are probably the most vulnerable to this thing getting out of control. And particularly, I've seen in recent days what's happening in Brazil, where there is it's a federated state. The governors of the big states, who were very close allies of Bolsonaro, who was a fully paid up member of the anti-science hope regime that we've seen out of America. There have been enormous splits in Brazil, and they were already deeply affected by what happened with the corruption scandals and the legitimacy of the Brazilian state. And that's been exacerbated by the completely appalling response of the president. So I think in Brazil, which is a huge chunk of Latin America's surface, and with enormous resources, and with a population that is plunging back into depression era levels of subsistence, I think the internal struggles in Brazil and reshaping of what is now really old-fashioned idea of left and right, I think could be very serious. I would hate to think what would happen, or what could happen, if the virus became very lodged in those favelas and areas around Rio and in Sao Paulo, which is really a city the size of Australia. It's just an enormous megalopolis. And I think you could wonder similarly what might happen in Mexico and Mexico City. So I don't know the answers to that, but I think these repay a lot of attention. And we're so focused on what's happening in our own countries or in comparable countries that what's going on in these huge urban areas and very relatively fragile quasi-democracies in South America and so on has really passed us by. And I think it's an area that we've got to look very closely at.
Okay, let me give you all a final question, because we're almost out of time. Starting with you, Glenda, but for all of you to address, what do you hope comes out of this? What do you hope changes as a result of this crisis? Glenda.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, my problem is, as an historian, you have limited founts of hope, actually, but then, but you do find that, okay, so I hope that governments and people, and by people I mean, people who can influence, and that can, in the 21st century, often that's entrepreneurs and philanthropists and business people who have a lot of influence, but also academics like myself, and people who are just engaged and want to be engaged, take the opportunity to really think about how to address this challenge as part of a broader set of challenges that are real and need to be addressed, and they're not short-term, they're long-term. I think the problem is we have governments, of course, that do think in the short term. The current government, even when it does rise to the occasion, it has thought short-term, whether it's bushfires or pandemics. And I think we really need to think long-term, and we need to rise to the occasion. And that means, I'll say it again, and I think that means constantly talking about, being realistic about the scale of the crises and anticipating what the connections between the different global challenges we face, and thinking about creatively and imaginatively, drawing on our past knowledge, thinking about how complex our present world is, but imagining a different kind of future.
Okay, Bill, what do you hope comes out of this?
Well, I at the outset, let me thank Committee of Sydney and you, Gabriel, for putting this together. It's been great. Look, I hope that we not only learn and discuss the lessons of how we got to where we are, but we really now resolve, in a way, to go back to what we used to be before a very wrong-headed political, economic and social movement took control of some of these matters and affairs, certainly in Australia. We've got to go back to assertion of democratic principles of openness, transparency, honesty, debate. The President Lincoln said, and they are good mottos going forward. We can no longer trust the people who got us to where we are. And that's not just in relation to this, but all of the accumulating intellectual superstructure they put on and over our country and similar countries. Now, we don't have time to discuss and debate this forever, but we've got to get back to the assertion of really strong principles, that the people are paramount, and that properly debated and educated and informed in honest, robust discussion, we can build something far better than we had up till about 2 months ago, or a month ago, 3 weeks ago. That's the lesson we've got to do, but the people have got to and will step up to the mark. I have every confidence in the Australian people. I've had a lot less confidence in the working out of Australian institutions, and particularly those who've been in charge of things. So that's the better future we can build if we all agree and come together and create it like we had to do after the Second War.
James, what do you hope comes out of this crisis?
Yeah, I mean, very briefly, because I know we're running up against time. I mean, I think you're, as Bill and Glenda said, you're looking to take a potential upside out of a downside. I mean, there's no smoothing over how bad this is going to be. But I was thinking of a book I read last year, Walter Scheidel, who's wrote a big, thick book called The Great Leveler, about moments in which social inequality was reduced. And his argument was basically, often it takes something very bad happening to rebuild institutions and make things better. And that could be, I think he talked about 4 things, mass mobilization warfare being one of them, and one of the others was pandemics. That after these moments of tragedy, new practices and institutions emerged that can make things better. That was true after the 2 wars, 2 world wars in the 20th century. It's been true at other points in history. We can see, in a sense, that it's perfectly possible to do this. We can see countries that have responded better than others. We can learn lessons. And as Bill said, you can see from the spirit of people volunteering for health services, the doctors who have gone above and beyond the call of duty, you see examples of things that provide you with hope. And so I think, in the long term, once you struggle through this, there's some reason for optimism that we'll learn a lot of lessons and rebuild, but it's going to be a long, hard road ahead.
All right. You guys, thank you so much for making time for this. Really, really interesting. All of you in the audience, thank you for joining, and hope you will keep tuning in for Committee for Sydney Live. We're going to keep doing this as long as we are all in lockdown or some variant thereof. And we're going to make the best of it and learn from thoughtful people both here and around the world. So with that, everybody, have a great rest of the day to the best of your ability.
Thanks, everyone.
You.
Bye.
Thanks for the forum.
Thank you.
Bye.